The moment didn't come with shouting. It didn't come with slamming doors or dramatic music the way viewers might expect. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost casually, and that's exactly what made it so shocking. Amy looked across the room and said something no one expected to hear from her. She admitted, without hesitation, that she didn't care if Tammy felt upset. For a few seconds, the entire room just stopped. No one jumped in. No one laughed it off. Even the cameras seemed to linger in that uncomfortable silence. And for longtime viewers who have followed this family's journey, that silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Welcome back to Sister Wives Daily, where we break down the moments reality TV doesn't always fully explain. And this particular moment between Amy and Tammy left fans asking questions the show itself barely addressed. Because for years, the dynamic between the sisters felt predictable. Tammy was often portrayed as the one who reacted emotionally, the one who exploded, pushed people away, or struggled to control her frustration. Amy, on the other hand, was usually the peacemaker, the one trying to smooth things over, the one trying to keep the family moving forward. But in this moment, something felt different. Amy's tone wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. If anything, it sounded tired, almost guarded. And what made the moment even more unexpected was Tammy's response, or rather, the lack of one. Tammy didn't snap back. She didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes or storm out the way viewers might have predicted in earlier seasons. Instead, she stayed calm, almost too calm. Her expression barely changed as Amy spoke, and that quiet reaction flipped the entire emotional dynamic in the room. Suddenly, Amy looked defensive. Tammy looked composed, and that reversal left viewers wondering what had been happening behind the scenes long before this moment aired. Because statements like that rarely appear out of nowhere. Was Amy speaking from built-up frustration the audience hadn't seen yet? Had the family already been dealing with tension between the sisters long before cameras captured this conversation? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why did Tammy choose not to react? Sometimes silence can mean someone is trying to stay calm. Other times it means they've simply stopped fighting. Fans immediately started dissecting the moment online, trying to understand what could have pushed Amy to be so blunt and why Tammy seemed completely unwilling to engage. But the tension didn't stay confined to that one conversation. Later, during what was supposed to be a lighthearted family outing at an escape room, the atmosphere between the sisters became even more complicated. Small comments, subtle body language, moments that felt awkward rather than playful. And that's when viewers started asking a question that might explain everything. Was Amy simply protecting her own peace, or was she quietly starting to push her sister away? To understand why that moment landed so heavily, it helps to rewind just a little. Because the tension between Amy and Tammy didn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. It had been slowly building in the background, especially once the conversation turned toward wedding planning. Weddings have a way of bringing out emotions that people didn't even realize were sitting under the surface. Decisions that might seem small to outsiders suddenly carry a lot of symbolic weight inside families. And one of the most sensitive choices in any wedding is who stands beside the bride as maid of honor. In many families, that role almost automatically belongs to a sister. It represents loyalty, closeness, and trust. It's a public sign that the bond between siblings is strong enough to hold that position. But Amy's decision didn't follow that traditional expectation. When she talked about the choice on camera, she explained it in a way that immediately caught people's attention. Amy said she wanted someone beside her who would support her without judgment. That single word, judgment, quietly shifted the entire tone of the conversation. Because when someone says they feel judged, it doesn't just describe a feeling. It also sends a message about the people around them. Suddenly, the unspoken question hanging in the air was obvious. Was Amy talking about Tammy? The comment seemed to suggest that Amy felt criticized more often than supported. And if that was the case, it hinted at a deeper frustration that viewers may not have fully seen before. From a psychological perspective, this type of dynamic isn't uncommon inside close families. When someone feels like they're constantly being corrected, questioned, or challenged, they can start interpreting even genuine concern as an attack. Advice begins to sound like criticism. Worry begins to feel like judgment. Eventually, the person on the receiving end stops hearing the intention behind the words and only hears the pressure. But there's another side to that equation, too. Sometimes people begin labeling accountability as judgment when they simply don't want feedback. When emotions are already high, even reasonable concerns can feel uncomfortable, especially if they challenge choices someone has already made. And that's where the dynamic inside this family became even more complicated. Chris and Misty, who often step into the role of calm mediators, seem to sense that the conversation could easily spiral if it wasn't handled carefully. Instead of taking sides, they tried to keep the atmosphere steady, making small comments that shifted attention away from conflict and back toward the bigger picture of the wedding itself. But even with their efforts, the tension in the room was noticeable, because underneath the polite smiles and careful responses, several questions were quietly lingering. Had Tammy expected to be Amy's maid of honor all along? Or had Amy already assumed Tammy would react badly, leading her to make the decision before the conversation even started? And perhaps most importantly, was this tension actually much older than the wedding discussion itself? Family disagreements rarely start in the moment we see on camera. Most of the time, they're the result of weeks, months, sometimes even years of small misunderstandings stacking up until one decision suddenly brings everything to the surface. As the conversation moved forward, something subtle began to change in the room. People started choosing their words more carefully. Jokes became quieter, and slowly, almost without anyone acknowledging it directly, the family seemed to start walking on eggshells around Amy. What made the situation even more surprising wasn't just what Amy said. It was how Tammy responded. Or rather, how she didn't. For years, viewers had become used to a certain pattern. When tensions rose, Tammy was usually the one who reacted first. Her frustration would show immediately. Sometimes it came through sharp comments. Other times it came through visible irritation or emotional outbursts. That history shaped everyone's expectations. So when Amy made such a blunt statement, many people watching assumed Tammy would fire back. But instead, Tammy went quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels explosive or dramatic. It was calmer than that, almost controlled. She listened, her expression steady, and didn't rush to defend herself or escalate the moment. For longtime viewers, that reaction felt almost unfamiliar. And it raises an important question about where Tammy is in her life right now. Over the past few years, Tammy has gone through significant changes. Her journey toward independence has slowly shifted how she approaches everyday situations. Living on her own has required building routines, learning responsibility, and creating a sense of stability that didn't always exist before. Even small things, like maintaining daily structure or spending time caring for animals, can change how someone manages stress. When life becomes more structured, emotional reactions often change too. Growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like fewer arguments, less chaos, less need to respond to every comment. And that might explain Tammy's reaction in this moment. Instead of matching Amy's bluntness with her own frustration, she seemed to step back and let the moment pass. But that calm response created an unexpected contrast. Because while Tammy appeared composed, Amy seemed emotionally overwhelmed. Her words carried the weight of someone who had been holding in frustration for a long time. Even though her voice stayed controlled, there was a sense that the pressure had been building beneath the surface. That contrast created something viewers rarely see in families that have long-established roles: a reversal. In many sibling relationships, people unconsciously settle into certain identities. One sibling becomes the caretaker, another becomes the rebel. One becomes the peacemaker, while another becomes the emotional center of the drama. But when one person changes, the entire system has to adjust. If Tammy is truly becoming calmer and more independent, that naturally shifts the balance the family has been used to for years. And when that balance changes, it can make everyone feel slightly off guard. The reactions that once felt predictable suddenly aren't there anymore. That's when confusion begins. Is Tammy staying quiet because she's learned to protect her own peace? Or is her silence something else entirely? Sometimes when people stop reacting, it's a sign they're choosing not to engage in the same patterns anymore. They've stepped outside the emotional cycle. Other times, silence can signal distance. A person may stop responding not because they've found peace, but because they've started emotionally stepping away from the situation altogether. And that possibility introduces a new layer of uncertainty. If Tammy is no longer willing to play the role everyone expects from her, what does that mean for the family dynamic moving forward? Because conflict often survives on reaction. Arguments continue because both sides keep responding to each other's energy. But if one side stops reacting completely, what happens to the conflict then? Stepping back from the moment for a second, it's also important to look at Amy's side of the situation a little more fairly. Because planning a wedding is stressful for almost anyone. Now imagine doing it while cameras are following every conversation, every decision, and every awkward family moment. That pressure alone can turn a simple disagreement into something that feels 10 times bigger. Reality TV has a strange effect on normal family dynamics. Small comments that might have been forgotten in a regular living room suddenly become storylines once they're filmed, edited, and shown to millions of viewers. Every reaction gets analyzed. Every word gets replayed. And when you know that kind of spotlight is hanging over you, it can make even calm people feel defensive. So it's possible Amy walked into that conversation already expecting criticism before anyone even said anything. If someone has spent years feeling like their choices are constantly being questioned, they might start bracing themselves for judgment even when the people around them are just trying to talk things through. In that kind of mindset, a simple suggestion can start sounding like a personal attack. And once someone feels cornered emotionally, their responses tend to become sharper. Which might explain why Amy sounded so blunt when she said she didn't care if Tammy felt upset. Sometimes statements like that aren't meant to hurt someone else. Sometimes they're a shield. A way of saying, I'm protecting my decision no matter what. But at the same time, the conversation didn't exactly calm down when the rest of the family tried to step in. Chris, who often ends up playing the unofficial referee in family discussions, tried to bring a little balance into the moment. Instead of pointing fingers, he suggested something pretty reasonable, that maybe responsibility didn't sit on just one side. In other words, maybe both sisters had contributed to the tension in different ways. It's the kind of comment meant to lower the temperature in the room. Spread the accountability. Give everyone a little breathing space. But Amy didn't seem interested in that middle ground. She pushed back almost immediately, rejecting the idea that the situation was shared responsibility. And that reaction created another layer of tension. Because when someone refuses to acknowledge even a small part of the conflict, the conversation usually stalls right there. No one really knows how to move forward. At that point, the room often shifts into an awkward balancing act. People start measuring their words, trying not to trigger another defensive response while still attempting to keep the discussion honest. And that's exactly what it started to feel like. Some family members looked like they wanted to say more, but held back. Others tried to lighten the mood with small jokes or distractions. But underneath those attempts to smooth things over, the bigger question was still sitting quietly in the background. Was Amy hearing criticism that no one was actually trying to give? Or were the siblings simply failing to communicate clearly with each other? Because misunderstandings inside families often grow from that exact gap, the space between what someone meant to say and what the other person believed they heard. And when that gap gets wider, even well-intentioned conversations can start feeling like arguments. As the discussion continued, the emotional tension in the room didn't disappear. If anything, it slowly started building again. Not long after that tense conversation, the family found themselves in a completely different setting, an escape room. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect reset. Escape rooms have a funny way of forcing people to focus on something other than whatever drama they walked in with. Instead of circling around the same emotional conversations, everyone suddenly has a shared goal: solve the puzzles, beat the clock, and get out before time runs out. For this family, that shift in focus created a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The moment they stepped inside the room and started looking around at the clues, some of the heaviness from earlier began to fade. People started laughing again. Someone made a joke about how none of them were going to figure out the puzzle in time. Another person started pulling random objects off the walls just to see what might happen. For a little while, the energy felt lighter. Chris leaned into the challenge with his usual mix of determination and playful commentary, while Misty tried to piece together clues in a more methodical way. The group started calling out ideas, testing combinations, and celebrating small wins when a lock finally clicked open. It was the kind of teamwork moment that reminded viewers why these family outings are usually so entertaining. When people work together toward a clear goal, something interesting happens psychologically. Their attention shifts. Instead of focusing on past arguments or lingering frustrations, the brain becomes occupied with problem solving. It creates a temporary pause in emotional tension because everyone is concentrating on the same task. And for a little while inside that escape room, that's exactly what seemed to happen. But even in lighter moments, viewers who pay close attention often notice the details that cameras quietly capture in the background. Small things. Body language. Expressions that flicker across someone's face for just a second. Tammy participated in the activity, offering suggestions and occasionally laughing along with the group. But there was also a noticeable calmness about her that felt slightly removed from the excitement around her. She didn't seem withdrawn exactly, but she also wasn't fully immersed in the playful chaos either. Almost like she was there, but observing more than reacting. Amy, on the other hand, laughed during several of the moments when the group struggled with the puzzles. Her sense of humor still came through, and she joined the others when a breakthrough finally happened. Yet even in those lighter moments, there was something a little guarded in her expression. The laughter felt genuine, but it didn't completely erase the tension that had been building earlier in the day. It's the kind of situation many families recognize. You can have a good moment together, even a fun one, while knowing that certain conversations are still waiting to happen later. The escape room gave the group something valuable. A break. But breaks aren't always the same thing as solutions. Once the puzzles were solved and the group stepped back out into the real world, the bigger questions didn't magically disappear. Had the activity actually helped ease the tension between Amy and Tammy? Or had the conflict simply been paused for an hour while everyone focused on cracking codes and opening locked boxes? Because while the family was enjoying this temporary reset, another major moment was quietly getting closer. The wedding day itself was approaching faster than anyone could ignore. Since the escape room, the subtle shifts in the family dynamic became even more noticeable. On the surface, things looked lighter. They had solved puzzles, shared laughs, and for a brief moment, the emotional storm from earlier seemed paused. But if you step back and look at the bigger picture, a more complex story was unfolding. One that viewers could feel even if it wasn't being said out loud. For years, Amy had carried the role of the stable sister. She was the one people relied on to stay calm under pressure, the one who supposedly had everything together. Tammy, on the other hand, had often been seen as the emotional wild card. Health struggles, personal setbacks, moments of impulsivity, these were the beats that defined her past seasons. Viewers watched as Amy navigated challenges with a combination of poise and control, while Tammy's reactions often drew both sympathy and concern. Now, everything was quietly shifting. Tammy's life had changed. She had built routines, taken responsibility for her daily life, and even found joy in volunteering at the animal shelter. Her emotional stability wasn't flashy or dramatic, it was quiet, steady, consistent. Yet that very steadiness created ripples. The sister who used to be perceived as unstable was now, in many ways, the anchor. Amy, on the other hand, began showing cracks in her composed exterior. Moments that would have previously passed with a shrug now seemed to hit her more sharply. Her reactions to minor disagreements, her sensitivity to perceived criticism, and even the way she carried herself around Tammy reflected a subtle but growing unease. This is where psychology comes into play. When one person in a family grows or changes, it doesn't just affect them, it forces others to recalibrate. Humans naturally expect familiar behaviors, especially from those closest to them. When those behaviors change, even in positive ways, it can feel threatening or destabilizing. People might react with defensiveness, skepticism, or heightened sensitivity because the script they have relied on for years no longer matches reality. In this case, Amy's identity, long tied to being the composed and reliable sister, was quietly being challenged. Tammy's calmness, her ability to step back and maintain her peace, created a new dynamic that Amy had to process, whether she wanted to or not. And processing change isn't instantaneous. It's messy, emotional, and often triggers more conflict before understanding emerges. Tammy's response, meanwhile, remained measured. She didn't escalate. She didn't argue. She didn't try to prove a point. Instead, she protected her peace, participating when necessary but holding emotional distance. That restraint was powerful, and in some ways it shifted the emotional balance in the room. What used to fuel confrontation, reaction, drama, overexposure was now muted. Viewers watching could sense the tension beneath the surface. There were no explosions, no shouting matches. Instead, there was subtle recalibration, a quiet adjustment of expectations that demanded patience and emotional intelligence from everyone involved. And it begs the question, was Amy reacting out of genuine concern, or did she feel threatened by her sister's progress? Was Tammy quietly stepping back for her own peace, or was she beginning to create distance from family patterns she no longer wanted to engage in? These questions lingered in the background, growing louder with every interaction. The wedding was no longer just a milestone event. It had become the stage where evolving roles, long-held identities, and unspoken tensions were all colliding. The real story wasn't the celebration itself. It was the subtle emotional recalibration happening in real time. And the stakes were only going to rise as the wedding approached. As the wedding day drew closer, the tension that had quietly simmered for months began to creep back into every interaction. Weddings have a way of doing that. They amplify not just the excitement, but every small undercurrent of unresolved family dynamics. Seating arrangements, speeches, photo lineups, even the order of toasts suddenly take on emotional weight. Who stands where isn't just logistics. Who gets included, who feels acknowledged, and who doesn't, all of it becomes symbolic. Amy was firm. This was her day. A fair point. Traditionally, the bride gets to choose her support system, to surround herself with people who make her feel safe and celebrated. She had already made her decision about the maid of honor, and she stood by it. Publicly, she radiated confidence, but subtle gestures revealed a streak of defensiveness. Every glance toward Tammy, every measured word, hinted at the unresolved tension underneath the surface. Tammy, meanwhile, had settled into a quiet, measured presence. She showed up, she participated in photos and rehearsals, she even laughed when jokes were made, but she held a careful distance. She wasn't absent, but she also wasn't giving Amy the reaction viewers had once expected. Her calmness wasn't passive, it was intentional. By maintaining this measured emotional space, Tammy subtly signaled that her peace mattered as much as family expectations. Chris and Misty floated between the two sisters like emotional referees. They tried to balance the bride's needs with the family history, smoothing over friction when Amy seemed on edge and offering quiet reassurance when Tammy's restraint was misread as detachment. Their efforts kept the room from tipping into outright conflict, but they couldn't erase the tension entirely. Weddings are emotional pressure cookers, and this one was no exception. Every hug carried subtext, every toast had an unspoken layer of scrutiny, and every smile had an undertone of calculation. Amy insisted on her choices, believing they were protective and necessary, while Tammy's quiet composure challenged the family's old scripts. For the first time, the stable sister was showing strain, and the chaotic sister was providing calm. The contrast was stark, and it didn't go unnoticed. Guests, staff, and even casual onlookers could feel the shift in energy. Nothing explosive happened, but the emotional currents were undeniable. Every moment of harmony felt fragile, like it could unravel if just one word went wrong. And through it all, viewers were left wondering, will Amy's insistence on control push her sister away? Or can Tammy's quiet distance lead to understanding? The wedding wasn't just about vows or celebration. It had become a stage for shifting roles, emotional recalibration, and the delicate negotiation of family history. The day of smiles, laughter, and shared memories was also the day when every glance, every pause, and every small interaction was loaded with meaning. And as the first ceremony preparations began, the question lingered in the air. Could these sisters truly reconnect, or had the distance quietly become permanent? Looking back at that moment when Amy said she didn't care if Tammy felt hurt, it hits differently now. At the time, it felt shocking, cold, like a line drawn in the sand. But seeing the wedding unfold, understanding the months of tension and quiet recalibration, it becomes more layered. Maybe Amy wasn't being cruel. Maybe she was asserting her independence, trying to carve out space where her choices wouldn't be second-guessed. Tammy's silence, in turn, speaks volumes. She didn't argue, didn't push back, didn't make a scene. She showed up, she participated, but she chose maturity over reaction. Her calm was a statement in itself. Sometimes growth isn't loud. It isn't explosive. It's subtle, steady, and deeply intentional. And in that quiet, Tammy reminded everyone, her family and the viewers, that personal boundaries and emotional self-protection matter just as much as family traditions and expectations. For years, viewers had seen the sisters in a predictable rhythm, Amy strong, Tammy reactive, chaos and emotion bouncing between them. But this season flipped the script. Roles shifted, expectations were challenged, and the family had to navigate uncharted territory. Weddings magnified those shifts. Small moments, a glance, a word, a pause, became charged with meaning. What once seemed trivial suddenly felt like a test of loyalty, patience, and understanding. The lesson isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about how families evolve, how patterns change when one person grows, and how emotional maturity can sometimes look like quiet distance rather than confrontation. Sibling bonds aren't static. They stretch, they bend, and occasionally they pause. And sometimes the biggest fracture isn't the argument that erupts, but the silence that settles afterward. As the audience reflects on Amy's words and Tammy's calm, it raises bigger questions about the Slaton family dynamic. How will these shifts ripple through upcoming events? Will old patterns return, or is this the start of a new equilibrium? Fans online have already started speculating, debating, and analyzing every moment. Reactions range from shock to admiration for Tammy's composure and curiosity about Amy's next moves. And that's where the story continues. Because in this family, nothing stays quiet for long, and every decision, every glance, every choice has consequences. The next chapter promises more surprises, more tension, and more moments where viewers are left wondering who will bend, who will break, and who will finally reclaim control over their own narrative.